네, 다음 순서는 제1세션입니다. 미국 대통령 선거 결과가 미국 대외정책에 미칠 영향이란 주제로 패널 토론을 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 좌장으로 연세대학교 국제학대학원 이정훈 원장님, 패널로는 미국외교협회 스캇 스나이더 상임연구원님, 경희대학교 정치외교학과 서정건 교수님, 미 헤리티지재단 총재 상임고문 제임스 카라파노님입니다. 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 제임스 카라파노님께서는 바쁘신 일정에도 불구하고 줌으로 참석해 주셨습니다. 팜플렛에 국문 번역 오류가 있습니다. 양해 부탁드립니다. 미 대통령 상임고문이 아니라 미 헤리티지재단 총재 상임고문인 점 참고 부탁드리겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It gives me great pleasure and honor to preside over the first session of this conference. I am particularly grateful, and I do congratulate the chairman of the Korea-America Association, Junghoon Lee. I would like to also extend my thanks to President of Sejong Institute, Lee Yong-jun, Ambassador Lee Yong-jun, for hosting this most timely conference on the upcoming U.S. presidential election. That said, we're probably going to have many more timely conferences and seminars as we lead up to the presidential election in November. That's still 8 months to come. But I think you can rest assured that we're going to have many more speculations and analyses on these as we lead up to the presidential election. And it's very important because there's a lot of speculations of what it might be, especially if there's a turnover in the government from Biden to possibly the second Trump administration. So here to look into various aspects of what it means for U.S. foreign policy. I think the security seminar today, as it's set up, starts from big to small. The first session, which is our session, looks to the presidential election and the possible outcome and what it means for U.S. foreign and security policy in general. And then I believe that in the second session, it will be narrowed down further as to see what the implications might be for the U.S. policy towards the Korean Peninsula. And to discuss these general implications for U.S. foreign policy as a whole, we have sitting to the right of me is Scott Snyder, who is currently still, I believe, with the Council of Foreign Relations, but will very soon, next month, be taking over as the head of the KAA, Korea Economic Institute. So congratulations, Scott. And to my left is Professor Seo as already introduced, who is the professor at Kyung University's Department of Political Science. And standing by, I believe, is James Carafano from the Heritage Foundation. So what I'll do is I'll have these three panelists give, I don't know, about 10, 15 minutes? Would that be about enough? Yeah. I'll provide them some space to give their piece of preparation for their views on the presidential elections, on U.S. foreign and security policy, and then we'll have some Q&As. I'll throw a few questions to the panelists, and then towards the end, before we take the coffee break at 10, I will come to the audience so that if you have any comments and questions, then you can address the specific panelists, or you can just address a question and maybe one of the panelists can answer that. So without further ado, I'd like to now turn to the first speaker, Scott.
Okay, well, thank you, Junghoon, and thank you, Chairman Chef, for the invitation to be here. I have to admit that on the one hand, I think that Chairman Jay has impeccable timing because I think that today or this week, both President Biden and former President Trump are clenching the number of delegates that they need for party nominations. And so this seminar is impeccably timed. But I also feel a little bit anxious because Ambassador Goldberg was so careful not to touch the election, and he made me feel like maybe I was in dangerous territory and that I could be making a mistake somehow. But what I really want to do is just give a picture of the choices between President Biden and former President Trump, what some of the main issues are in the election, and then what I think the implications may be for U.S. foreign policy and for the U.S.-Korea relationship. As I do that, please keep in mind that my main job is really as a Korea watcher. I'm not an America watcher, but I'm going to try to provide the context necessary based on just being in Washington. And if you're in Washington, you're kind of absorbing politics just by breathing the air. And so a lot of what I have to say is basically what one can glean from being an avid consumer of the news in terms of how Americans are positioning themselves and thinking about the election. So I think that obviously we have a rematch between Biden and Trump. Both candidates are very well known. And we know that both candidates have distinct worldviews. And so most of the election, of course, will be focused on foreign policy, on domestic issues. And frankly, I'm expecting a lot of the election to also be about personalities and approaches. But both candidates do have very distinct and different views on America's role in the world. And the way I would characterize President Biden is that he's basically a traditional post-World War II internationalist. As I look at the way that his foreign policy has unfolded over the course of the past 4 years, it feels very familiar and it feels very conventional. President Biden is clearly someone who believes that the U.S. has a global leadership role and someone who has been active in particular in trying to counter perceived aggression by various countries that might be revisionist in their worldview. Former President Trump, I would say, is an individual who clearly also values peace through strength. But in a way, I think of President Trump as a really old-style politician, in that our founding father, George Washington, recommended that we not be involved in quote-unquote entangling alliances. And sometimes I think that President Trump is following the advice from our founding fathers because it's clear from his comments about various alliance partners that that is not necessarily a key aspect of his worldview. And the other aspect, I think that President Biden clearly takes responsibility as a leader of the free world. President Trump seems to be wanting to shift that responsibility away from the United States. And then if we look at American public opinion about global leadership, well, there's some anxiety about overcommitment. I do think that there are elements of retrenchment in the U.S. public opinion, but overall there's also, I think, continued strong support for the idea that the U.S. should maintain a global leadership role. Really, the interesting part of the public opinion is in the segment of Americans that are some of the most avid Trump supporters, Republicans who have lost their support for the U.S. international role. And so that, I think, shows in some of the main surveys like Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And overall, in those public opinion polls, Korea is rating fairly well. There's been a little bit of a dip in support for the idea that the U.S. should come to Korea's aid a contingency, but it's still a majority. Now, what does the election environment really look like? Well, I think that the main issues that have emerged as flashpoints in our debate, I mean, you just have to turn on the American news, probably also reported in the Korean news, to find out what the candidates are talking about, and both candidates recently visited the border, the U.S. border with Mexico. And I think that that is shaping up to be a major issue that we'll hear a lot about in the coming months. Another big issue that, in particular, President Biden and his team is focusing on is related to abortion rights. And so I think there will also be a lot of discussion in American domestic politics and during the campaign, on that issue. And then we also do have areas where both candidates have very different global views. So I've already mentioned the border. Another issue that I think is important, but is not necessarily going to be front and center, is the shift in the discussion around America's economic strategy. And I think what's really interesting about that particular issue is the focus on rebuilding the U.S. industrial base and on strengthening the workforce that is occurring primarily in the context of a discussion of supply chain resiliency and friendshoring. And we have to see what is going to happen, but I think that among the Trump advisors are some people who would like to really ramp up on that issue and maybe even strengthen the focus on rebuilding America's industrial base even more. And then I also want to mention one other foreign affairs issue that has domestic political ramifications in the United States. And honestly, most foreign affairs issues don't have direct domestic political ramifications. But I think one of the critical issues that does have an impact on voters is the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. And it's really, I think, risen to a kind of crescendo in recent weeks. But the thing that I really want to point out there is that in critical swing states like Michigan, President Biden is at risk of losing support from Palestinian Americans, and the level of that non-support is potentially great enough to shift the outcome in a state like Michigan. And so, that is a very interesting case where President Biden has taken a very strong stand in support of Israel, and it is costing him not only in Michigan, but also among younger generation Democrats. We'll see how things play out. I just want to focus on a few issues where I think there are particular differences between Biden and Trump that will draw interest from our allies and partners. One obvious one that I've already mentioned is related to the Biden administration's emphasis on reinvigoration of alliances and the idea of strengthening support with allies in the face of authoritarian forces around the world. And, President Trump, and most recently in his comments about NATO, clearly is not showing that same value and actually has been very strong in support of strong leaders, dictators. And so that is a big difference between Biden and Trump. Another difference, I think, is related to, in Trump's foreign policy, rather than a foreign policy strategy, I would actually argue that President Trump imagines a Trump world order. one in which his centrality and the U.S. centrality in international relations should be the factor that will drive decisions. And I think that one interesting takeaway that we can see from the first Trump administration actually is that despite President Trump's lack of, dissatisfaction with the relationship with allies, in fact, most American allies tried to move closer to Trump in the first administration. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see whether how allies respond, having already had that experience from the first administration. And then another set of issues that I think is going to draw a contrast between Biden and Trump that has implications, I think, for Korea is related to views of climate and climate change. And we all know that President Trump withdrew from the Paris climate change agreement. President Biden has rejoined it. But the really interesting issue in that area is really the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the commitment of the United States under the Biden administration to pursuing electrification. President Trump is really more focused on traditional energy sources of supply, and that has an impact on Korean business, especially Korean inward investment on the United States, because a lot of the Korea is actually the #1 investor in the United States in clean tech right now. And a lot of this is related to batteries and EV factories that will benefit to the extent that we push forward in implementing the Inflation Reduction Act, but they will not benefit if we move more slowly. And there is a question about President Trump's commitment to the IRA. I don't think that he can override established legislation, but he can issue executive orders that would slow that down. A second international issue where I think there's a strong contrast between Trump and Biden is really related to the relationship with Russia. And we see that playing out in the US Congress right now in terms of Republican opposition to funding support for Ukraine, and also the sense that President Trump could, as he puts it, could solve that war in a day. But it's highly likely that that would mean withdrawing support from Ukraine, which would have reverberations across Europe as the U.S. accepts the bid of a revisionist actor in Putin. And then another issue, I think, is related to China. And there, I think the big question is, what's really interesting is that the Biden administration continued a lot of policies that were originated in the Trump administration and really doubled down on those policies and built a strategy around the idea of China as a rival. And one of the dimensions of that approach has been the building of alliances, including the Camp David Summit and the U.S.-Japan-Korea cooperation, the Indo-Pacific strategy. How much of those strategies would a second Trump administration maintain in the context of a U.S.-China rivalry? And how much would the Trump administration abandon? And then last, on South Korea, I'll just say that a lot of people here, have been focusing on, they remember that Trump had a special relationship with Kim Jong-un. And the question, and obviously President Biden, I think it's safe to say, has had no relationship with Kim Jong-un. And so there's a lot of speculation that President Trump would try to re-engage with Kim Jong-un. I happen to be a kind of skeptic on that issue, but it is an issue where there is a potential difference between the Biden and Trump administration. I personally think that the Hanoi summit provided a cautionary legacy for both Trump and Kim Jong-un that would probably shape the views of both sides in favor of being very cautious about renewing that relationship. Plus, the context here on the peninsula has changed in the transition from the Moon to the Yoon administration. And so I personally am skeptical that we're going to see a big shift in U.S.-North Korea relations driven by a Trump-Kim bromance. But I want to highlight it as one of the issues that gets a lot of attention. And so maybe I think I've probably already talked too long, so I'm going to stop there, and we'll pick up the rest in discussion. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Scott, for your brilliant analysis. But what we really want to know is who's going to win? Huh? And we'll come back to that a bit later. Let me now turn to the second panelist, Professor 서정건.
저는 그 동시 통역이 있다고 하니까 우리말로 하겠습니다. 방금 소개받은 경희대학교의 서정건 교수입니다. 우선 이렇게 귀한 자리에 초대해 주셔서 감사 말씀드리고 특별히 우리 최준경 회장님과 또 우리 한미협회 관계자분들께 감사하다는 말씀 먼저 좀 드리고 싶습니다. 저는 그 아카데미아에 있는 사람이어서 이제 미국 정치와 이제 미국 특별히 이제 미국 의회, 그다음 미국 대통령 이런 미국의 정치 제도와 미국 외교 정책 간의 상관성 이쪽을 공부하는 사람입니다. 그래서 조금 뭐 이런저런 좀 디테일한 말씀들을 좀 드리게 될 것 같고요. 스캇 얘기한 것처럼 스캇은 이제 코리아 워처라고 이제 했는데 저는 이제 코리아 아니지만 아메리카 워처입니다. 그러니까 아메리카 워처가 제일 이제 좀 무서워하는 자리는 이제 아메리칸들이 있는 자리가 좀 무서운데 네. 좀 잘 해보겠습니다. 또 뭐 개인적인 말씀이지만 미국에서 석사 박사 교수를 하면서 15년을 살았기 때문에 제 딸 둘이 지금 미국에서 학교를 다닙니다. 그래서 미국이 잘 돼야 합니다. 개인적으로 네, 그런 뭐. 네, 저기 책자에 보시면은 5페이지에 보시면은 그 제가 PPT를 가지고 좀 말씀을 좀 드려보려고 합니다. 우선 이제 2024년 그 미국 대선과 외교 정책 관련된 그 빅픽처 차원인데요. 우선 굉장히 이번 대선이 특별히 뭐 늘 언제나 미국 대선이 특별히 이제 우리 입장에서는 외교 정책 관련돼서 중요한 선거입니다만은. 이번 미국 대선 관련돼서는 우선 양극화와 의회 약화가 동시에 진행되고 있는데 양극화가 단순히 그냥 보수 진보 간의 양극화가 아니라 공화당 내에서의 또 분열 혹은 민주당 내에서의 이견 이런 것들이 있습니다. 이제 우크라이나 전쟁 같은 경우에는 뭐 니키 헤일리로 대표되는 쪽과 그 다음에 이제 트럼프로 대표되는 쪽에 이 이견이 있고요. 공화당 내부에 특별히 또 공화당 유권자들과 공화당 의원들 간에 또 불일치가 좀 있습니다. 그다음에 이제 이스라엘 하마스 전쟁 같은 경우에는 공화당은 굉장히 똘똘 뭉쳐 있는데 프로 이스라엘로 이제 민주당 내부에서는 그 젊은층과 또 아랍계 미국인들이 굉장히 그 바이든한테 프레셔를 주고 있는 상황이고 아까 스캇이 잠깐 얘기했습니다만은 지난번 미시간 프라이머리에서 미국은 사실 굉장히 재밌는 그 연결 지점이 발생한 게 이 프라이머리에서 foreign policy가 이슈가 된다는 건 굉장히 쉬운 문제가 아닙니다. 미시간에 있는 그 조직체 이름이 Listen to Michigan이라고 하는 그 시민단체에서 운동을 했어요. 그래서 미시간 프라이머리에 나가서 바이든 찍지 말고 uncommitted이라고 하는 거는 이제 지지 후보 없음입니다. 여기에 좀 찍어라. 그래야 바이든한테 우리의 힘을 보여줄 수 있다. 본선에서. 보통 그 uncommitted가 보통 그 예전 같은 경우에는 2만 명 정도 찍었는데 이번에 10만 명이 넘었습니다. 미시간이 2016년 대선 때 힐러리와 트럼프의 차이가 한 표 차이가 10,000표 정도 됐고요. 2020년에는 한 훨씬 더 컸는데 미시간의 그 뭐 디어보원이라든지 이런 지역에 에랍 아메리칸들이 한 15만 명 산다고 합니다. 그래서 저한테 만일에 이번 미국 대선 경합주 중에 가장 중요한 주를 꼽으라면 저는 뭐 단연코 미시간을 뽑겠습니다. 왜냐하면 트럼프 입장에서는 애리조나와 조지아를 다시 회복하고 라티노들한테 인기가 있으니까 네바다까지도 몇십 년 만에 처음으로 이겨도 이 바이든이 미시간, 위스콘신, 펜실베니아 이 미드웨스트 3개 주만 킵하면 바이든의 일렉토럴 칼리지가 270명이 됩니다. 미니멈 머저리티입니다. 538에 머저리티는 270인데 딱 270명이 됩니다. 그래서 이 미시간이 굉장히 중요한 주가 되는 거고요. 어쨌건 굉장히 유권자들 상황, 외교 정책 상황 이런 것들 미국 정치 내에서 굉장히 흥미로운 디벨롭먼트를 보이고요. 또 이번 대선은 이제 현직 대통령이 있는 대선이다 보니까 현직 대통령 프리미엄 가능성에 대해서 우리가 무시할 수 없다. 특히 지금 아까 스캇 얘기한 것처럼 미국 내에서 가장 큰 이슈가 되고 있는 것이 이제 보더 크라이시스인데 이민자들의 문제고 작년 12월 달 기준으로 한 달에 30만 명이 불법 이민으로 넘어왔다고 합니다. 피츠버그라고 하는 도시가 30만 명이 좀 안 됩니다. 한 달에 피츠버그가 생긴 셈이에요. 거기다가 조지아 주에서 여대생이 이렇게 피살되는 사건도 터지고요. 트럼프는 벌써 테러리즘 얘기를 합니다. 이런 상황이 지금 이 보더 크라이시스에 대한 경각심을 높이고 있는데 이 바이든한테는 비장의 무기가 있는 것이 인컴번트 프레지던트이기 때문에 적절한 시점에 이그제큐티브 오더 같은 걸 발동해서 템포러리 셧다운 같은 걸 할 수 있습니다. 그러니까 이 인컴번트 프레지던트, 프레지던셜 일렉션에 현직 대통령이 가지고 있는 프리미엄에 대해서 우리가 한번 생각해 볼 필요가 있다. 그다음에 대선 결과에 따라서 여러 가지 재미있는 것들이 있는데 이제 우크라이나 전쟁 같은 경우에도 지금 어떻게 프레임을 잡느냐가 굉장히 관전 포인트입니다. 트럼프는 우크라이나에 왜 쓸데없이 지원하냐. 우리 보더가 지금 뚫리고 있는데 보더를 먼저 지켜야 된다라고 하는 입장인데 비해서 바이든은 우크라이나 전쟁을 푸틴 반대로 몰고 갑니다. 이번에 State of the Union Address 들어보셨는지 모르겠는데 보통 소투라고 이제 짧게 얘기하지만 바이든 대통령의 연두교소 의회 연설에서 한 1시간 좀 안 되게 연설했는데 가장 먼저 어떤 토픽을 꺼낼까? 사실 왜냐하면 연두교소 틀어놓고 사람들이 끝까지 안 봅니다. 미국 사람들이 1시간 내내 뭘 보겠어요? 그러니까 가장 먼저 어떤 화두를 꺼내는지가 중요한 건데 굉장히 놀랍게도 바이든 대통령 우크라이나 얘기를 먼저 꺼냅니다. 플러스 어떤 전략을 펼치냐면 1941년에 FDR이 했던 No Ordinary Time이라고 하는 굉장히 유명한 프레이즈를 씁니다. 그러니까 바이든이 굉장히 재밌는 지금 변신을 하고 있는 게 에이지 문제를 지금 테이크 온 하는 거예요. 사실 에이지, 고령, 무기력, 노쇠함 이런 이미지 있지만 에이지가 주는 또 장점이 있습니다. 84년에 레이건이 월터 먼데이를 웃겼듯이 당신의 inexperience와 youth들을 내가 시비 걸지 않겠다. 그래서 월터 먼데이도 빵 터지게 한 레이건의 유머를 생각해 보시면 이번 연두교수에서 히스토리라는 단어가 17번 나옵니다. 굉장히 재밌는 이 바이든의 새로운 전략인 것 같아요. 그래서 연두교수 끝나고 나서 1분짜리 선거 캠페인 동영상의 시작을 뭐라고 하냐면 I'm not a young guy. That's no secret. But here's the deal. 이런 얘기를 합니다. 그래서 바이든이 에이지 문제를 굉장히 새롭게 접근하는 것 같다는 생각이 좀 들었고요. 그 다음에 사실 이번 대선 결과가 저한테는 가장 중요한 포인트는 뭐냐면 포스트 트럼프 시대와 포스트 바이든 시대 중에 어떤 시대가 먼저 열리느냐. 사실 바이든 시대는 제가 볼 때는 트럼프는 지금 2016년부터 거의 10년 동안 미국 정치에 지금 핵심 인물로 자리 잡고 있는데 트럼프에 대한 평가는 포스트 트럼프 시대에 가능합니다. 지금은 트럼프 정당이 됐지만 프라이머리 얘기고요. 과연 공화당이 트럼프 정당이 되었는가는 트럼프가 떠나봐야 알 수 있다. 스탠다드 베어러가 없는 상황에서 트럼피즘이 남아있을 수 있느냐. 이거는 포스트 트럼프 시대가 해결할 수 있다라는 말씀을 좀 드릴 수 있고 이제 1페이지 했는데 네. 자, 쭉 넘어가겠습니다. 넘어가서 좀 빨리빨리 말씀을 좀 드리겠습니다. 트럼프 1기 행정부, 경제는요, 지금 경제가 조금씩 좋아지고 있지만 인디케이터 상으로 보면 too little일 수도 있고요, too lazy일 수도 있고요. 또 하나 중요한 건 lack of message입니다. 82년에 레이건이 stay the course. 굉장히 파워풀한 메시지를 통해서 84년 대선에서 압승했는데 지금 바이든 대통령한테서 stay the course 하는 그 강력한 메시지를 발견할 수 있느냐? 그렇지 않고 이미 바이든은 바이드나믹스라고 하는 용어는 안 쓰기로 결정한 것 같아요. 그러니까 그런 차원이 있지만 바이든한테 조금 위안거리가 되는 거는 미국 정치가 좀 희한해졌습니다. 이 이코노믹 컨피던스, 경제 체감 지수와 대통령의 이 지지율이 다이버지 되기 시작해요. 2008년 오바마 대선의 굉장히 중요한 의미입니다. 경제와 인종은 미국 역사에서 정치에서 서로 다른 축이었는데 경제와 인종이 지금 뒤섞어 버렸어요. 오바마 대통령 이후에 제가 여기 보여드리는 그 이 다이버지하는 그 패턴, 뭐 그런 말씀 좀 드릴 수 있고, 트럼프 일기 행정부 외교 정책 특징으로 넘어가 보면 뭐 여러 가지 잘 기억하시는 대로 트럼프의 별명이 테리프맨이라고 합니다. 트럼프는 테리프를 정말 좋아합니다. 왜냐하면 테리프를 가지고 자기가 행정명령 기반하에 자기 마음대로 플렉서블 할 수 있기 때문에 의회를 거치지 않고 이제 대통령이 혹시 되면 재선 성공하면 이 그 74년 트레이드 액트에 있는 301조, 저희가 소위 통상 슈퍼 301조라고 하는 그걸 가지고 이제 테리프를 운영할 텐데 트럼프의 항상 포인트는 레비뉴가 쌓인다. 컨슈머들이 느끼는 이 비용, 피해 이런 것들은 굉장히 와이드 스프레드이기 때문에요. 사실은 컨슈머들이 이렇게 잘 체감하지 못합니다. 어쨌건 테리프를 가지고 막 옥죄다가 갑자기 스탑해서 저희가 봤지 않습니까? 2020년에 퍼스트 미니 딜이라고 하는 거. 중국하고 갑자기 딜을 해버리는 거예요. 왜냐하면 대선 해에 농업주의 지지가 필요했기 때문에 그런 거죠. 그러니까 테리프를 가지고 하면 폴리티컬 머니버링이 가능한 그런 통상 정책이다라고 하는 생각을 가지고 있고요. 그 다음에 이제 트럼프 시대 때 제가 일기 때 가장 재밌게 본 것 중에 하나는 트럼프 대통령이 하는 포린 팔러시하고 우리 스캇이 속해 있는 아메리칸 포린 팔러시 커뮤니티하고의 관계입니다. 단적인 말씀드리면 지소미아 가지고 문제가 됐을 때 트럼프는 지소미아의 G자도 얘기를 안 했어요. 관심이 없으니까. 근데 아메리칸 포린 팔러시 커뮤니티는 굉장히 중요한 문제로 접근을 했습니다. 그 방위비 분담금 같은 것 가지고 트럼프가 한국을 굉장히 이렇게 프레셔를 줄 때 아메리칸 포린 팔러시 커뮤니티는 굉장히 우려했습니다. 아니 제일 무기 많이 사가고 동맹으로 가장 성공적인 케이스인 대한민국을 왜 대통령이 자꾸 괴롭히나 포린 팔러시 커뮤니티가 굉장히 우려를 했는데요. 만약에 트럼프 2기 행정부가 되면은 자기가 1기 행정부 말미에 하지 못했던 스케줄 F라고 하는 행정명령을 발동해서 보통 미국 대통령이 백악관에 오면 한 3,000명 정도를 폴리티컬 어포인티를 데리고 올 수 있는데 스케줄 F라는 걸 쓰면 5만 명까지 페더럴 거버먼트에 채울 수 있다고 합니다. 자기 생각에 1기 행정부의 실패는 페더럴 거버먼트가 딥스테이트여서 본인의 정책을 실천하지 않았다. 고로 내가 대통령이 되면 2025년에 스케줄 F라고 하는 행정명령을 통해서 다 대기 발령시키고 자기 충성파 5만 명으로 채우겠다라고 하는 것이 트럼프의 지금 생각입니다. 자, 통상 문제 방금 말씀드렸고요. 밥 라이트하이저가 아마 USTR이 될 거라고 워싱턴 DC에서 많이 얘기들을 합니다. 근데 밥 라이트하이저의 No Trade is Free라고 하는 최근 책자에 보시면 그 사람 생각 같은 것들이 많이 반영돼 있고요. 자, 그런데 여전히 문제는 이제 공화당이 이 보호무역 정당이 되었는가? 이것도 사실은 포스트 트럼프 시대에 확인해 볼 수 있는 사안입니다. 왜냐하면 트럼프 집권 1년 전에 2015년에 오바마가 자기의 원래 공약과 달리 TPP를 위해서 TPA를 달라고 트레이드 프로모션 어토리티를 달라고 미국 의회에 얘기했을 때 미국 공화당 쪽에서 압도적으로 트레이드 프로모션 어토리티를 오바마한테 줍니다. TPP 하라고. 다만 이제 2016년에 트럼프 승리로 TPP는 날아갔지만요. 자, 안보는 뭐 여러 가지 이제 더 말씀 나오겠지만, 제가 재밌게 본 거는, 작년 연말에 이제 그 국방수권법이라고, NDAA라고 통과됐을 때 거기에 어멘먼트가 붙었는데요. 팀 케인이라고 하는 버지니아 세니터 데모크래시고, 마코 루비오 플로리다 리퍼블리칸 세니터가 같이 어멘먼트를 낸 것이 뭐냐면, 대통령이 나토에서 탈퇴하려면 미국 상원의 승인을 받아라. 라고 하는 어멘먼트를 첨가시켜서 통과시켜서 지금 현재 그것이 미국의 법입니다. 자, 그럼 미국 상원의 승인을 받아야 나토에 탈퇴했을 때 당연히 트럼프를 염두에 두고 통과시킨 어멘먼트인데, 자, 그러면 트럼프가 그러면 그 어멘먼트 때문에 나토에서 탈퇴할 수 없느냐? 전혀 그렇지 않습니다. 미국 정치 역사에서 제가 마지막에 쓴 카터의 예가 1979년 1월 1일 날 미중 국교 정상화를 할 때 덩샤오핑이 카터한테 요구합니다. 원 차이나 팔러시. 카터가 1954년부터 맺어져 왔던 미국 대만 상호 방위 조약을 하루아침에 폐기해 버립니다. 이걸 어떻게 했을까요? 미국 의회가 굉장히 반발했는데 베리 골드워터라고 하는 애리조나 그 상원 의원이 수프림 코트로 가져갑니다. 수프림 코트의 결정은 이건 폴리티컬 퀘스천이다. 니들이 알아서 해라. 그래서 폐기됐습니다. 하루아침에. 그러니까 그런 전례가 있다는 걸 좀 말씀드리고 싶고요. 시간이 없으니까. 국방수권법 같은 경우에도 저희가 이제 트럼프 혹시 당선되면 인플리케이션이 뭐냐에 대해서 저희가 논의를 하고 있는 중이라서 국방수권법도 NDAA 안에 뭐 그 22,000명 아래로는 주한미군을 철수하지 못한다라고 못 박아 있다라고 이제 언론에서 나오는데 NDAA의 원문을 보시면 제가 원문을 가지고 왔습니다. 원문에 보시면 구조가 리밋하겠다. 의회의 재정 지원을 리밋하겠다. 그다음에 unless가 나옵니다. unless. 갑자기 뭐 영어 문법 시간이 아니지만 이걸 뒤집어서 얘기하면 if인 경우에는 리밋할 수 없다는 얘기예요. if 뒤쪽은 뭐냐면 DOD의 그 세크레터리가 뭐 미국 국익에 별 문제 없다. 한국, 일본 상의했다. 뭐 이런 얘기 하면 리밋 못 한다는 얘기입니다. 하여튼 뭐 이런 그 굉장히 좀 더 우리가 좀 디테일하게 바라봐야 될 것도 있고요. IRA 같은 경우에는 스카트 잠깐 얘기했지만 IRA가 만일에 요번에 11월 5일 날 미국 하원 435명, 미국 상원 35명을 다시 뽑는 선거를 치르는데 트럼프가 대통령이 된다는 얘기는 결국에는 이 공화당 유권자들의 대거 투표로 인해서 공화당이 하원과 상원을 119대 의회에서 장악한다는 의미입니다. 그러면 트럼프 1기 행정부 당시에 첫 2년처럼 단점 정부가 되는데요. 기억하실지 모르겠지만 2017년에 이 트럼프라는 사람이 굉장히 재밌습니다. 공약을 철저히 지키는 좋은 대통령입니다. 트럼프가 2016년 캠페인 기간 내내 했던 말이 뭐냐면 오바마 케어를 폐지하겠다. 근데 오바마 케어 안에 뭐 비용도 그렇고 중산층의 반대도 있지만 오바마 케어 안에 pre-existing condition이라고 하는 굉장히 중요한 요소가 들어있어요. 그래서 어떻게 했냐면 트럼프가 그거를 빼고 법을 새로 만듭니다. 오바마 케어 Repeal and Reconciliation Act of 2017. 여기서 그 pre-existing condition 걸 뺀 거예요. 그걸 계속 남겨두고 이걸 가지고 7월 달에 푸시합니다. 이렇게 되면 이 reconciliation이라는 자가 붙으면 필리버스터가 작동 안 합니다. 단순 과반수로 상원에서 통과가 돼요. 마치 IRA가 2022년 8월 달에 단순 과반수로 통과됐듯이 똑같습니다. 그래서 트럼프가 대통령이 되면 공화당이 상원 하원을 다수당을 장악하면 이름을 바꿔서 IRA and Reconciliation Act of 2025를 만들 겁니다. 제가 볼 때는. 그런 경우에는 입법적으로는 폐기가 되는데 문제는 뭐냐면 이 IRA에 지금 공화당 상원의원, 하원의원이 전부 반대했었는데 그 과실을 공화당 지역구에서 다 따먹고 있습니다. 현실적으로요. 다음 페이지 보시면 12페이지 보시면 이 그 IRA에서 주는 텍스 크레딧이나 여러 가지 그 뭐 규제 뭐 완화 이런 것들에 대한 그 그린 에너지 이 서브시디나 이런 것들을 누가 가지고 가고 있냐면 특히 대표적으로 마지막 라인에 그 Qcells 한화에서 하는 그 배터리 산업인데 이 마조리 테일러 그린이라고 이번에 그 바이든 대통령 연두고에서 보셨는지 모르지만 바이든 입장할 때 그 빨간 옷 입고 여기 빨간색 모자 쓰면서 마가 여기 붙어 있는 그 마조리 테일러 그린의 이제 별명이 여자 트럼프거든요. 그 사람 지역구입니다. 하나 Qcells,가 2빌리언짜리 공장 만든 곳이. 그러면 마조리 테일러 그린 입장에서는 바이든이 통과시킨 IRA를 폐지해야 되겠는데 자기 지역구에 2빌리언짜리 공장에 들어선단 말이에요. 어떻게 할 것이냐? 뭐 조금 복잡합니다. 자, 하우스 레이스는 뭐 제 시간이 많이 지나서요. 지금 현재 공화당이 좀 유리하다고 보고요. 마지막으로 미치 머카널이 이제 요번 선거를 끝으로 공화당 상원 원내대표를 그만둡니다. 그런데 이 사람이 제가 여기 그림을 일부러 가지고 온 것이 연설하면서 자기가 I'm not going anywhere. 2년 더 임기가 남아 있어요. 그래서 미치 머카널이 혹시 트럼프가 대통령이 되면 트럼프를 견제하는 마지막 수호 천사가 될 수도 있다. 제가 뭐 미치 머카널을 좋아하는 건 아닌데 미치 머카널은 전통적인 이번에 우크라이나에 $95 빌리언 주는 그 법안에도 미치 머카널은 찬성했습니다. 22명 찬성, 26명 반대였는데 공화당 상원의원 중에 미치 머카널은 찬성했어요. 트럼프 첫 2년 동안에 미치 머카널이 트럼프가 하려는 외교정책의 대변화에 대해서 상원에서 뭔가 스탑할 수도 있는 그런 인물이 될 수도 있지 않나. 마지막으로 한미일 협력이 트럼프 이기 행정부에서 어떻게 될 것인가는 제가 볼 때는 트럼프 입장에서는 싫어서 없앨 것이 있고 몰라서 내버려 둘 것이 있습니다. 제 느낌에는 쉽게 말씀드리면 한미일 삼각협력은 후자입니다. 그래서 키는 뭐냐면 의회가 예산을 지원해서 어떤 조직체를 만들면 적어도 트럼프는 임기가 4년밖에 안 되기 때문에 트럼프 4년 동안 계속 우리가 논의할 수 있다. 특히 그리고 마지막 시점은 뭐냐면 트럼프가 만일에 11월 5일에 당선이 되면 11월 중순부터 12월 중순까지 한 달 동안 레임덕 카нг레스가 열립니다. 118대 의회가 지속되는 거예요. 트럼프가 드디어 됐어. 드디어? 네. 트럼프가 됐네? 그러면 의회가 어떻게 나가야 될지에 대한 시간이 한 달 남아 있다는 뜻입니다. 우리 정부가 의회를 상대로 여러 가지 같이 협력을 해서 그 한 달 기간 남은 동안 우리가 뭔가 협의체를 만들어낸다면 한미일 삼각협력을 우리가 계속 얘기할 수 있다라고 하는 것이 제 생각입니다. 네, 좀 길어져서 죄송합니다. 여기서 마치겠습니다.
예, 서정경 교수님, 미 대선 그 제도적 배경에 대해서 아주 그 훌륭한 발표를 해주셔서 대단히 감사하고요. 이 4년마다 치러지는 미 대선을 보면은 특히 이제 여론조사를 보면은 사실 이 외교 분야에 있어서는 이 투표를 하는 데 있어서 불과 3% 적게는 많게는 7% 정도 영향을 미치지 않습니다. 주로 이제 경제인데 아까 경제 얘기도 뭐 잠깐 하셨는데 사실 지금 경제가 좋거든요. 그 뭐 조금 뒤늦은 감이 있다라고는 말씀을 하셨는데 지금 미국 경제가 3% 정도 성장을 하고 있죠. 그 실업률 굉장히 낮죠. 그리고 지금 주식시장 뭐 상한가 치고 있는 것 같고, 그리고 뭐 그 중앙은행의 인트러스트도 좀 이제 내려갈 전망이요. 이 정도면 사실 인컴번트인 바이든이 뭐 거진 유력하게 재선이 돼야 되는데 지금 그렇지 않거든요. 이게 굉장히 좀 그 재밌는 지금 상황이 벌어지고 있어서 이거 그 마지막 발표 후에 이 부분에 있어서 좀 그 설명을 해주시면 좋겠고요. So, Dr. James Carafano, you've been very patient. I hope you're still there, and I hope it's not too late in Washington, D.C. So the floor is yours. I'll give you about 10-15 minutes to give your take on the U.S. upcoming presidential election and its implications for U.S. foreign policy.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak about the implications of the U.S. national elections for the future of American foreign policy. I think one of the things we tend to forget when we talk about the impact of having a new U.S. president is we focus on, well, what might change, and we ignore what might stay the same. So I thought I would talk both about change, but also about the continuity in American foreign policy. American foreign policy fundamentally is based on national interest. Presidents can have very different rhetoric. President Trump famously said, America first. But if you really think about that, what he meant was he was going to put America's interests first. It was an interest-based foreign policy. President Biden often talks about international obligations and multilateral cooperation. But fundamentally, American foreign policy for Democrats is still about national interests. Although sometimes Republicans and Democrats interpret what is in America's best interest differently. But there are some things that we haven't seen change. For example, from President George W. Bush through the current administration, American presidents have focused on the challenges of China, Iran, and Russia. That's remarkable when you think about very different presidents, Republican, Democrat, very different priorities, but yet fundamentally they came back to the same three challenges. And there's a reason about those three nations in particular, because they have the greatest capacity to disrupt and destabilize the parts of the world that are most vital to the United States. The United States is a global power with global interests and global responsibilities. We really don't consider ourselves the world's policeman or the world's babysitter, but we do have worldwide interests. And like every nation, we feel an obligation to defend those interests. Like many countries that have global interests, you can't do that from your own shores. And for the United States, what is critically important is the peace and stability of the parts of the world that link the world together. It doesn't mean that our expectation is there are no wars and no instability, but that generally these areas are peaceful and stable because they allow the United States to extend their interests for both economic and political and diplomatic importances for the United States. And those regions are Western Europe, the Greater Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. And so not surprisingly, we always return to China, Iran, and Russia because those are the countries that have the most capability and have demonstrated the most willingness to aggressively threaten U.S. interests in those regions. Now, of course, different presidents have addressed these concerns in different ways, but they've all kind of focused on these three important initiatives. I think that's an element of continuity that will continue regardless of who wins the national elections in 2024. What is vital is that all three are going to remain important. I mean, often we hear, particularly in contemporary debates in the United States, the notion about shifting to some theaters at the expense of others. So famously, since the era of President Obama, we've talked about the pivot to Asia. But in practice, and I don't think this will change, America is going to remain deeply engaged in all three theaters. You know, for instance, despite talking about the pivot to Asia, today we are deeply engaged in supporting Ukraine and Western Europe and supporting Israel in the Middle East. But yet we still focus on the concerns in Asia, particularly in Northeast Asia, with dealing with North Korea and in Taiwan and in the Philippines, and all along the first island change. Often we hear concerns that from our European and Middle East allies that we're going to leave and go to Asia. Well, we hear concerns from our Asian allies that we're going to return into the others and neglect their responsibilities there. Look, the United States is going to have to deal with all three of these. And in particular, if you look at our military capabilities, the notion of a pivot kind of really doesn't make any practical sense. For instance, we talk about pivoting to Asia to deal with the China challenge, which in many ways is primarily a maritime threat. Well, 70% of the American Navy is already in the Asia-Pacific theater, and the other 30% obviously can't leave to go someplace else because we do have other worldwide missions. For example, right now, we've got a heavy presence in the Mediterranean, both because of our demands for supporting in both Europe and the Middle East. 90% of our Army is permanently stationed in the United States. And that's not likely to change because the United States needs to be able, again, to flex to any theater, critical theater, to respond. And we don't really have a big enough military to pre-position a great amount of military in any one theater. Our Navy is positioned around the world, and that likely won't change, and that likely won't matter because the United States is almost unique in being the only Air Force which really deploys globally. So it really doesn't matter where our Air Forces are. They can deploy someplace else, and indeed, it's a dramatic advantage to have our Air Force dispersed around the world so we can respond relatively rapidly, and the Space Force is in space. That's not going to change. So I think that's an important element of continuity, that the United States will be present and I think relatively strong in all three theaters in different ways, in different mixes with different strategies, but U.S. engagement I think will be as vibrant regardless who is the president. The other element of continuity that I'd like to briefly address is strategic forces. So how we balance our conventional forces, that's one challenge, and there might be some changes there. But I think it's really important to remember the bipartisan consensus that we've developed on the importance of strategic forces. I think this includes both offense, nuclear forces, and defense, the increasing proliferation, particularly of missile defenses. There were, I think, maybe a decade ago, a lot of controversy about the future of the U.S. strategic arsenal. For example, President Obama famously came to office talking about a road to zero, the idea that the United States would self-weaken our nuclear capability and de-emphasize the strategy and forces, and that would lead to global disarmament. President Biden, when he came in office, the first thing he did was return to strategic arm talks and engagements with Russia. But the reality is, particularly focusing not just on the increasing nuclear threat from North Korea, but the dramatic increases in the Chinese nuclear arsenal, I think both Republicans and Democrats have come to really accept the importance of the U.S. strategic nuclear deterrent, not just for the protection of the United States, but for the nuclear umbrella that provided extended deterrence to our friends and allies in critical theaters, and particularly in Europe, in the Middle East, and in the Pacific. And the one thing I would count on is the continued expansion, development, and robustness of missile defenses and the American strategic nuclear deterrent. It was just a few years ago when there was a serious debate whether the United States would retain a triad, or whether it would modernize nuclear systems, or field a new nuclear bomber. I think all those questions are answered. Now, obviously, there's some difference between Republicans and Democrats, but there's deep consensus for the United States remaining in the nuclear competition. And I think on balance, the notion of real initiatives and gains in arms control are fairly unrealistic, even with the notion of recent suggestions of discussions between the United States and China and Beijing on nuclear talks. The prospects on that I think are very small, and of course the prospects of returning to nuclear talks with the Russians are probably improbable. Those continuities I think are very important. So I think there's a good prospects that there'll be both conventional deterrence and American strategic deterrence in all three critical theaters. But it's also important to back about what'll change. One thing I think would change if a Republican would be elected would be increasing focus on a fourth theater, really kind of the home ground. U.S., Canada, Latin America. Obviously, border security and immigration is one of the most hot button issues in the campaign. I would expect a president to come in and aggressively tackle that issue. But it's not just a question of illegal immigration from Latin America. We've had such a breakdown in our immigration enforcement and security that all the illegal human trafficking networks from Asia, from Africa, from the Middle East are reorienting on coming to Latin America and to the U.S. That's a very significant concern that I think a Republican president would very aggressively go after. In addition, we've seen increasing influence from China and Russia and Iran in Latin America that increasingly create national security threats for the United States. We've seen a pretty significant imbalance between regimes which are favoring those countries and countries that are firmly in kind of the U.S. camp. I would almost expect an American president, for Republican, to move back to something like the Monroe Doctrine, which really looked at pushing aggressive, destabilizing foreign influences out of the theater. One area that I think would be a specific and initial priority for the United States is Venezuela. Venezuela is one of the key countries in funneling global illegal migration to the United States. They are threatening a war with their neighbor, which might happen before the end of the year. They are deeply embedded with the Chinese. They work closely with the Cubans. They're a significant destabilizing force in the theater. That destabilization floods into other countries. This administration, present administration, has had a policy of engagement. I think that's going to be completely reversed. And in many ways, I think Venezuela will be kind of the trendsetter for Republican policy in the theater. So I think very aggressively countering the malicious activity of the Venezuelan regime will be a priority, along with border security and immigration. So that's an area of, I think, very, very sharp departure. The second area of sharp departure that I would expect is in the Middle East. Now, again, Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter. That's a region of importance to the United States. But I think you'd see a very different focused on a regional approach. The present administration is very much focused on engagement with Iran as really the key to stability in the theater. So if Iran is the chief instigator of instability, the notion is reaching an accommodation with Iran, slowing their commitment to declaring themselves as a nuclear power, that in conjunction with trying to settle the fate of the Palestinians in the region, that was the key to moving forward. I think you can expect exactly the opposite from a Republican administration. They will completely believe that engaging with Iran is not the way to go. Rather, they will go to, I think, a very, very heavy focus on containment. I don't think anybody is going to start with regime change or attacking Iran, but they will absolutely try economically, politically, militarily to contain Iran. They will, again, I think, put a very low priority on a two-state solution and support for Palestine. They will put a lot of emphasis on regaining the confidence of the Arab nations in the region of firm U.S. commitment and support. Obviously, I think they'll go back to really emphasizing the importance of the Abraham Accords and the normalization of that process. Much more stronger support for Israel. A lot of support for global connectivity. So the notion recently discussed of I2U2, right? The idea of connecting India through the Middle East, opening up other corridors, whether it's a railroad through to Israel or the Baghdad to Basra corridor. I think these are things the United States will greatly support. That, I think, is really important. A second area of increasing interest, I think, is going to be Africa, because it's not just about the influence of China in Africa, probably a 500 million additional people in Africa. That issue alone, if unaddressed, can lead to all kinds of consequences for everyone. So neither the United States nor Europe, nor countries in the Middle East, or even Asian countries which commit some attention to Africa, including India, Japan, some South Korea, can have enough influence to really move the bubble in Africa. And I think what a Republican administration will be doing is looking for more cooperation to synchronize our efforts with the United States, our European allies, our friends in the Middle East, and our friends in Asia, to try to have more constructive partnerships and deliver better outcomes in stability, prosperity, and growth and security cooperation in Africa. Of course, there'll be concerns about the Ukraine war. I actually think an American president is going to walk in and find a strategic stalemate in Russia And I mean, we hear lots of things on the campaign trail, but I think the reality is, look, if a Republican president is elected in 2024, it's going to be because of domestic issues, crime, immigration, border security, woke policies, inflation, the debt, the economy. And the president's going to focus like a laser on those issues. And he's only going to deal with the foreign policy issues that are really kind of front burner. I actually expect Venezuela policy and Iran policy to kind of be the first out the door. On the other ones, I think he has some time, and I think that's particularly true in Europe, where the president will take his time, take several months to come up with a foreign policy there. I think the U.S.-Korea role partnership outside just the regional interests, that there will be a lot of opportunity and areas for cooperation and engagement with Republican president. I mean, we already see Korea as a key defense partner with Poland. I think the United States would like to partner with Korea in expanding economic cooperation, defense cooperation, defense industrial development. Globally, I think there are many areas where the U.S. and Korea are natural partners that have impact worldwide. In the defense sector, obviously in cyber and space development, I think those are key areas for cooperation. But I think, and I don't like the term development because I don't think that's the right model. I don't think foreign aid and government development is really going to deliver prosperity and economic integration. But I think partnership and supporting the private sector, I think that is important. And so I do think there's a role there for Korea and the United States to cooperate in the Indo-Pacific, certainly in East Africa, in parts of Western Europe where there's plenty of opportunity for infrastructure development, but also extending through the Caucasus and into Central Asia, the Central Asian states. So I see a lot of opportunities for this global cooperation. And what I've always argued is, well, it's important to get the U.S.-Korea partnership beyond just the security issues of Northeast Asia. Looking at global security issues, but also global economic, political, diplomatic areas where our partnership can bring an awful lot to the table. And there are so many key areas around the world in which we have a common interest in peace and stability. Certainly in West Africa, certainly in the greater Middle East, certainly in Western Europe, and extending to the Caucasus and Central Asia, that it is really time to kind of take the U.S.-Korea global partnership to the next level. And I do think that's a vision that we would see strongly engaged through a Republican administration. So I'm very optimistic that regardless, Republican or Democrat, U.S.-Korea relations are going to remain strong. But if I'm just honest, and I'm not a political guy, but if I'm just being honest, I see a lot more opportunity in a Republican partnership in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Carafano. So that's our three panelists giving their general observations. I have three very quick questions that I want to field to the panelists. Not all of them have to answer. And then, if time permits, I will turn to the audience for maybe a couple more questions. I want to come back to the point that I raised to Professor Seo, that and this is something that James also mentioned, that in U.S. foreign policy, U.S. presidential election, foreign policy does not really matter that much. It's really more the domestic policies. And I did mention that the economy, I don't know whether, James, you got the translations, but the American economy right now is, I think the GDP is 3% growth. The stock market is doing pretty good. Unemployment rate is low. Interest rates is probably going to come down. So, all the indications would suggest that Biden should be, the incumbent should be the front runner, but it looks like he's not. So how do you account for that? Can I get a very quick take on this?
Can I?
Sure, of
can
course.
I speak very briefly?
Yes, of course.
So I think what you have to do, I do think the domestic issues really predominate. And I do think on the economic issues, you really have to dig under the numbers. And so just let me use employment as an example. most of that employment is temporary employment, people getting a second job because they can't pay all their bills. It's employment going to foreigners in the United States, or it's in Florida. The rest of the country actually is not seeing really dynamic job growth. And when you look at the unemployment number, the unemployment numbers have left off the chronically unemployed, which are actually becoming a significant number of voters. And so particularly when you look at in traditionally Democratic voting blocks, union workers, Hispanic Americans, and blacks, we are seeing a lot of discomfort with the state of the economy. And so when you hear the thing is, well, Americans just don't understand how good the economy is, that's not true. The economy isn't working for them. And so there is a lot of dissatisfaction of voters in the economy. And we've all mentioned border immigration security, which is really becoming a truly national issue. Thanks.
Thank you. Professor Seo?
네, 경제와 선거는 우리 이 교수님께서 굉장히 중요한 포인트를 제기해 주셨는데요. 사실은 이게 시대에 따라서 political context에 따라서 경제 문제가 정치 변수화하는데 굉장히 다양성이 있습니다. 제가 보는 현재 미국 정치는 양극화가 굉장히 심각한 시대라서 양극화는 뭘 방해하냐면 accountability를 방해합니다. 무슨 말씀이냐면 경제가 좋아요. 근데 나는 우리 대통령이 싫어요. 그러면 우리 대통령에 대한 지지율을 안 높입니다. 경제가 나빠요. 근데 우리 대통령이에요. 그러면 지지율을 많이 빼지 않습니다. 양극화라는 것이 그래서 굉장히 무섭다는 말씀 먼저 좀 드리고요. 그래서 바이든한테 유리하게 작동할 수 있는 컨텍스트다라는 말씀을 드릴 수 있고, 경제는 저같이 정치학자 입장에서 말씀드릴 수 있는 건 뭐냐면 두 가지가 중요합니다. 타이밍 is everything입니다. 결국 이제 하반기에 만일에 경제가 다시 조금 안 좋아지는 기색이 있다 그러면 굉장히 바이든한테 빅 펀치가 될 겁니다. 또 하나 중요한 거는 정치학자 입장에서는 메시징입니다. 아까 제가 잠깐 말씀드린 것처럼 80년대 초반에 지미 카터가 물려준 굉장히 나쁜 두 가지 경제 스태그플레이션 상황에서 레이건 당시에 레이건 초반에 81년에 또 계속 언임플로이먼트 올라갔지만 82년 이후부터 조금씩 내려옵니다. 내려오는 이 시점에 레이건이 미국 역사에서 유일하게 The Great Communicator라고 하는 별명을 가진 레이건이 Stay the Course라고 하는 굉장히 파워풀한 메시징을 냈기 때문에 84년 미국 대선에 압승할 수 있었다라고 하는 거, 그 두 가지를 말씀드릴 수 있고요. 2024년 미국 대선은 해석이 어려운 것이 지금 경제에서 우리 이 교수님 말씀해 주신 여러 가지 언임플로이먼트나 스톡 마켓이나 다 좋은데 미국 유권자들이 가장 크게 느끼는 것 중에 하나는 인플레이션입니다. 잘 아시는 대로. 자, 이것이 해석이 좀 쉽지 않은 것이 뭐냐면 작년에 9%였는데 이번에 3%로 내려왔다라고 바이든이 굉장히 얘기를 많이 합니다. 여기서 우리가 놓치면 안 되는 것이 인플레이션은 레이시예요. The increasing level of general prices가 인플레이션의 정의입니다. 무슨 말씀이냐면 이미 굉장히 많이 인플레이션 물가가 올라갔는데 작년에는 9% 비율로 더 올라가던 것이 올해는 이 상황에서 3%밖에 안 올라간다, 이 뜻이에요. 미국 국민들은 인플레이션에 대한 체감 어마어마합니다. 지금도 사실은. 자, 그런데 그것이 지금 보더 크라이시스 때문에 오히려 경제가 조금 묻혔어요. 그래서 경제가 더 나빠지지만 않으면 바이든한테 유리하게 갈 수도 있다. 또 마지막으로 잠깐 하나는 특히 미시간 같은데 혹은 이 경제와 관련돼서 지금 바이든은 유니언 가입니다. 트럼프는 테리프맨이에요. 유니언 가이 대 테리프맨의 이 싸움이 어떻게 결판이 날 것인가도 한번 재밌는 관전 포인트일 것 같습니다. 네.
Yeah, I'm just going to add a point that I think connects the previous two responses, because I agree completely that, you know, the dilemma that the Biden administration faces is that the aggregate numbers are good, but people don't feel it in their pocketbooks. And I think that's directly related to the inflation issue that Professor Seo was speaking about. And in particular, I would look at cost of housing as one of the factors that is significant for the U.S. consumer.
Okay, thank you. I've actually personally been following the campaign trail quite intently, and so I've been looking at the Republican candidate, Donald Trump's campaign speeches, and he's very boastful that had he continued as the president in the past 4 years, that there would not have been an invasion of Ukraine by Putin, that there would have been peace in Israel, that China would not have been as aggressive as we all know that it's been. And I think his supporters believe that, and he is very convincing. And even if I kind of listen to him, you know, it seems very convincing in the way that he speaks with such conviction. What do you think? I mean, if he comes to the office, is there a possibility that all these issues that that's blowing up in the global stage could be handled?
Well, okay, I get a chance to start. I mean, I think that the biggest area that I see that maybe is really critical is actually on Ukraine, and we're facing a crisis right now, just highlighted by Bill Burns, our Director of National Intelligence, CIA, yesterday, in front of Capitol Hill, where he said that the Ukrainians are not lacking in willpower or resolve, but in ammunition. And that is a direct result of the crisis as related to funding for supply of ammunition that is a result of a deadlock in the US Congress. And so I do think that that is a major issue that, in my view, would potentially be exacerbated by my take on Trump's view of the war in Ukraine. And I do believe that he could make that go away. I think that it would be at a cost. And I also believe that the overall strategy, it's very interesting that during the Trump administration, there was less global conflict. And I do believe that that was in part because the world couldn't handle the level of uncertainty that would have been involved in conflict under Trump. And so I do think that it's a factor, but it's not necessarily a reassuring factor in my view.
James? You want to have a
Yeah,
take on?
so like I said, I think Europe will actually be relatively stable because it'll be a strategic stalemate. I think it already is. I don't think that'll change. I think the theater that's going to see the most disruption is the Middle East. The Middle East is already on fire. Trump's not going to come in and put it out. He is going to come in with a very, very different policy that I think, in fairness, did work during his administration, but it's not 4 years ago. And can it take us back to an issue of stability? I think we'll see. But as the professor said, I think the point is yeah, I would agree. Trump's voters, even people that don't like Donald Trump but might vote for him anyway, even they would say they thought his foreign policy was better, and they really believe that. But that's not what's going to turn this election. I think that's pretty clear.
Professor?
네, 지금 미국 유권자 지형을 보시면요, 이제 always Trump 30%, never Trump 30%, maybe Trump 30% 정도로 보시면 될 것 같습니다. 자, 그래서 본선에 가면 트럼프와 바이든이 진짜 경쟁을 제대로 할 거다라고 하는 말씀 드릴 수 있는데, 그 maybe Trump 30% 입장에서는 트럼프가 하는 그런 메시지, 예를 들면 자기가 대통령이었으면 우크라이나 전쟁 안 일어나고 이스라엘 하마스 전쟁이 안 일어났을 거다라는 거에 대해서는 좀 시큰둥할 겁니다. 사실은 그게 많이 믿지 않을 거고요. 또 하나 재밌는 포인트는 뭐냐면, 우리 윤석열 정부에서 지금 한미 관계 강화하면서 extended deterrence를 위해서 굉장히 애를 많이 썼는데, 트럼프가 인터뷰하는 거를 보고 제가 깜짝 놀랐어요. 트럼프가 인터뷰하면서 뭐라 하냐면 자기가 대통령이었을 때 김정은과 잘 지냈다 라고 하면서 이 소위 디터런스를 자기 본인이 하는 것으로 얘기를 합니다. 그러니까 디터런스라고 하는 정책이 인스티튜셔널라이즈 될 것인가, 또 한 번 퍼스널라이즈 될 것인가가 굉장히 중요한 포인트가 될 겁니다. 이번 대선도. 네.
And finally, And I wanted to stay away from the Korean Peninsula issues because that's the second panel. But I do want to ask a question, especially since Dr. Carafano is here, and as you all know, heritage is very closely associated with the Republican platform. There's a cautious murmur in Korea that if President Trump becomes the president come next year, that he will be a little more tolerant of South Korea's nuclear option as a way of increasing South Korea's portion of burden sharing, as well as increasing what he is emphasizing in terms of the strategic defense in Korea as well as in the Indo-Pacific as a whole. Is that a possibility? Do you think that he will be a little more tolerant of the nuclear option, which is being talked about? Because we know that the Washington Declaration and the current extended deterrence is, of course, we're fully committed to that. But there are question marks as to, is that enough in view of North Korea's continuing buildup of its nuclear arsenal? James?
Yeah, as I said, there are probably a very limited number of foreign policy issues that the administration will have to jump on coming in the door. I think the Middle East, because it's on fire. I think some of the initiatives in Latin America because of the border in Venezuela. But I think on European and many of the larger Asian issues, those are not things that the president's going to walk in the door with a baked policy on. And I also think we have to distinguish between, and again, this is going to come up more in the Korean panel, distinguish between things that are put out there as posturing and negotiating positions and things that are a matter of strategy. Trump always includes a negotiating option in his strategy. That it's not the strategy, but it's part of the strategy. It's the off-ramp. If you want to stop, we'll do this, and if you don't, there are these consequences. So, whether the option is talked about more broadly or not, I don't know. It gets really, really complicated very, very quickly. We may have a nuclear Iran before we come into the next presidential term starts. Iran might declare itself a nuclear power, even if it doesn't have a functioning weapon. That's going to create a lot of issues globally about proliferation. Is Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Egypt just going to sit there on its hands if there's a nuclear Iran? And so when any country contemplates, or you contemplate supporting any country getting a nuclear arsenal that doesn't currently have one, particularly if it's already a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it has global impact. And so the short answer is there's not an easy answer to that question. It's not the kind of thing that they're worried about now because right now they're just trying to get elected. It's not the thing they'll have time to deal with after, if they win. They won't have time between November and January to deal with that. And it's one where you will have to get a national security and foreign policy team in place. Here's what I would say, which I think is important. When I look at the likely roster of key people that will come into the national security foreign policy space, many of them are veterans of the last administration who are actually, I think, very well regarded and understand how to work with the president and very level-headed. Unfortunately, I don't think Steve Biegun will be back, which I think is kind of sad, but many others I'm sure will. And they're very, very familiar with the Korea issues. People like Allison Hooker. And so I don't think you'll get a policy that's not thought through. I'll just say that.
Okay, thank you.
짧게 하겠습니다.
네.
제 생각에는 그 트럼프의 메시지보다는 2025년, 2026년 첫 임기 2년 동안에 트럼프의 액션이 중요하다. 예를 들어서 그 첫 임기 2년 동안에 김정은 위원장과 좀 배드 딜을 하게 되는 경우 이렇게 되면 어디랑 연결되냐면 2026년 한국 대선 캠페인 기간과 맞물리게 됩니다. 그래서 한국의 대선 캠페인 기간 동안에 미국의 트럼프가 보여주는 이상한 행동들을 보고 한국 자체 행무장을 내세우는 대선 후보들이 나올 수 있다. 그래서 한국 정치 스케줄과도 굉장히 밀접한 관계를 가지고 있다고 저는 생각합니다.
Yeah. So as I promised, I know we're now cutting into the coffee time, but maybe like 5-6 minutes. I will ask maybe a couple of people to raise your hand and ask questions or make very short comment if you like. Please identify yourself and then be specific about the question and who you want from the panel to answer that question. You don't have to, actually. We can finish this early if you like. Anyone? No? No. Oh, there's, yes.
I would like to ask a question to Professor Sir, since he's a U.S. watcher, and I think he's following the election very closely. So at the end of the day, as we all know, it's really up to the swing states, so-called the pink states. So Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, those states. So what is your assessment on those states, if you do have one at this point in time? Because it's going to all come down to that, those states, who's going to win, because it's pretty much neck and neck. What we see in the press about national, popular polls, doesn't really matter in the end. So I would be interested in hearing your views.
스윙 스테이트는요, 사실 뭐 잘 알려진 대로 스윙 스테이트는 보통 지금 현재 6개 정도 얘기합니다. 그래서 이 남쪽으로 네바다, 애리조나, 조지아, 그 다음에 미드웨스트 지역에 미시간, 위스콘신, 펜실베니아, 이 6개 정도를 얘기하고요. 그 다음에 하나, 두 개를 더 추가하자면 노스캐롤라이나를 추가할 수 있고, 그 다음에 버지니아를 추가할 수 있습니다. 지금 현재는 제가 아까 말씀드린 대로 가장 중요한 스윙 중에 스윙 스테이트는 미시간이라고 저는 보는데, 예를 들면은 지금 민주당은 굉장히 노스캐롤라이나도 공을 좀 들일 겁니다. 왜냐하면 미시간을 잃어버려도 미시간에서 져도 노스캐롤라이나를 이기면 미시간의 일렉토럴 칼리지가 15명이고요. 노스캐롤라이나는 16명입니다. 한 명 더 버는 셈이에요. 또 하나는 애리조나와 조지아 중에서는 애리조나에 더 공을 들일 겁니다. 왜냐하면 이게 정말 미국 그 정치 이렇게 좀 들여다보면은 정말 하루라도 놓치면 정보를 자꾸 놓치게 되는데요. 예를 들어서 올해 11월 5일에 애리조나에서 Constitutional Amendment를 통해서 Abortion Rights를 확보하려는 지금 움직임이 있습니다. 그래서 Abortion Rights를 위한 Constitutional Amendment를 위한 그 보터 이니셔티브가 지금 취해지는 그런 선거에는 민주당 유권자들이 많이 나오게 돼 있습니다. 그래서 바이든 같은 경우에는 조지아보다는 애리조나에 더 공을 들일 가능성이 많다. 이런 말씀을 좀 드릴 수 있고요. 네바다는 굉장히 재미있는 것이 앞으로 미국 정치에서 라티노가 중요한데 라티노가 생각보다 정말 좀 아이러니하죠. 트럼프가 굉장히 라티노에 대해서 나쁜 말, 막말 많이 하지 않습니까? 그런데 특히 라티노 남성들 사이에서 트럼프 인기가 괜찮습니다. 네바다가 지난 몇십 년 동안 항상 블루 스테이트였는데 이번 대선에서 만일에 리퍼블리칸 파티로 넘어가면 굉장히 그건 미국 정치 미래에 있어서도 중요한 시사점이 있다. 이렇게 볼 수 있습니다. 그렇지만 어쨌건 네바다, 애리조나, 조지아를 다 트럼프가 이겨도 미시간, 위스콘신, 펜실베니아만 바이든이 킵하면 270명이 되고요. 또 하나 오늘 안 나온 얘기 중에 2020년 팬데믹을 기점으로 미국이 이전에 한 번도 안 하던 것이 있습니다. 뭐냐면 얼리 보팅입니다. 얼리 보팅 때문에 2020년에 바이든이 8,100만 표를 얻었어요. 유례가 없는 일입니다. 이번에도 일렉션 데이가 아니고 일렉션 윅스가 될 겁니다. 하루에 투표하는 것이 아니라 3주 동안 투표합니다. 스트럭처럴리 민주당한테 유리한 대선 구도입니다.
Okay. And final question, and then, okay, two very short questions, if you don't mind.
네, 조선일보 이하원 논설위원입니다. 아주 흥미있게 잘 들었고요. 저는 짧게 아무래도 바이든 대통령의 고령 이슈가 지금 문제가 되고 있기 때문에 부통령 후보이 누가 될 거냐 이것도 굉장히 중요한 걸로 좀 생각이 되는데 카말라 해리스 부통령이 사실 굉장히 좀 인기가 없고 생각했던 것보다 그 퍼포먼스가 좋지 않기 때문에 최근에 이제 재밌게 하나 들은 얘기는 부통령 후보로 예를 들어 버락 오바마를 부통령으로 올려서 미국의 헌법에는 2번 연속 선출될 수 없다고 돼 있지 3번 할 수 없다는 건 없기 때문에 그런 식의 그러고 나서 바이든 대통령이 임기 중에 내가 힘들면 오바마에게 맡기겠다는 식으로 또 넘길 수 있지 않느냐는 조크를 또 듣기도 했었는데 부통령 후보로는 사실 좀 누가 거론되고 이게 또 하나의 변수가 될 수 있을지 거기에 대해 좀 여쭙고 싶습니다. 이상입니다.
I'll give a actually.
통역이 되나요? 그저 제임스한테는? James, the question was who the possible vice presidential. Yeah, you got the translation?
I did.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think, in the U.S. system, vice presidents used to matter when we had parties that were regionally and ideologically diverse. And so a vice president might be very key in bringing in a regional vote. And that's not really the case anymore. We look at the last handful of vice presidents, they were picked really for, kind of administrative competence. So, Bush had Cheney, Obama had Biden because they thought that was a senior statesman there. Trump had Mike Pence because he was a respected congressman and strong with evangelicals. Kamala Harris was considered, important because she was the first woman vice president. But I don't think in any presidential election that we've had in recent memory that I can think of, the presence of the vice president on this ticket really decisive in changing the election results. And because of the many factors the professor mentioned, I think it's very unlikely that a vice presidential pick will make a difference. It might make a slight difference for somebody like Trump if he could find somebody that helps him with a key demographic. For example, a vice president who was maybe more influential with middle-class white educated women voters. But arguably, would that really matter? I mean, people vote for the president. So I think the likelihood of replacing Harris on the ticket is nil. And I think that's just where we are.
아주 짧게 질문을 해주시면 감사하겠습니다.
My question is related to the foreign economic policy. President Biden initiated very persuasively Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is basically dealing with the rule-based system in the Pacific, not really opening of the U.S. domestic market. So under that condition, is President Trump, if he's elected, is he going to continue this Biden's Indo-Pacific economic framework, or maybe he might revise it, or maybe don't care about it? Any panelists to answer this question?
Okay, James, you want to answer that?
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, we can.
Nope. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think one of the big question marks is what is going to be the economic, foreign, and trade policy. There's not a trade consensus really in either political party. Heritage does something in each presidential election called the Mandate for Leadership. We did it for this election. It's online. It's like 900 pages. When you actually get to the section on trade, what you see is there's not a trade policy because there's no orthodoxy among Republicans and conservatives, and it looks more like a series of options. And so I think much of this will depend on not just if Trump's elected, but who are the people that he brings into the White House, and how does that dynamic result in determining what the strategy is. So and this is actually one where I would say, don't start with a presumption of what Trump would do. what I would tell friends and allies is if Trump does win, move very quickly to engage and be proactive and say, this is what we'd like you to do. Get into the part of debate with his administration on policy, and as opposed to presuming what it's going to be, or as opposed to just sitting there and waiting for a policy to emerge.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So with that, I've overwent the time. I do want to thank the three panelists for an excellent overview and insight into the upcoming presidential election as much as they could. I mean, there are many questions that would, that's raised and will continue to be raised, but there's no clear-cut answer. But I think the three panelists did an excellent job in providing as much insight as they possibly can. And as mentioned by the panelists, U.S. foreign policy has always been a tug of war between isolationism versus interventionism, or internationalism, if you will. And particularly that's the case in the first half of the 20th century, but today, in 2024, I think it will be almost impossible for the United States to go back to the old ways of isolationism. I mean, we're just too intertwined in the interdependence of the global network. So there's some trepidations about the return of Trump, but I think we have to remember that the U.S. presidency, I mean, U.S. is a prototypical democracy. There is the role of the office of presidency. There's a check and balance system. And also, what tension there might have been in the first term Trump administration. We have to remember that it's as much a byproduct of who the South Korean counterpart was. It's no longer that president. We have a new president who is fully committed to the alliance, and we're on a very solid track to further consolidate that. So I believe that even if there's a change, that the U.S.-South Korea alliance will remain rock solid into the next 4 years. So hoping for that, and I think this kind of conference is so useful because I think it not only analyzes, but in an indirect way, we provide guidelines to the incoming administration as to how things should be, at least in U.S.-Korea alliance relations. So with that, I'd like to once again thank the host and for all the audience. So let's give a very nice round of applause for the three wonderful panelists. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 수고 많으셨습니다. 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. 네, 시간 관계상 잠시 장례 정리 후 바로 제2세션을 진행하겠습니다. 행사장 뒤편에 커피와 다가가 준비되어 있습니다. 행사 진행 중에도 즐기실 수 있으니 많은 이용 바랍니다. 잠시 후 뵙겠습니다.